Hello, everybody. Welcome to USD Conversations, our speaker series that features faculty, alumni, and friends who share insights around current events and timely themes. The events this fall semester, following our summer series, is hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences and USD's Humanities Center. So today's event falls on Constitution Day. And this is a day commemorating the signing of the U.S. Constitution on this day in 1787. USD does something every year for Constitution Day. It also, however, marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which is in the Constitution now, which prohibits the states and federal government from denying the right to vote to U.S. citizens on the basis of sex. So our history professor emerita, Iris Engstrand, PhD, is here to discuss the history and significance of the 19th Amendment and what role it plays in an election year, and how important it is to our Constitution and as an amendment to our Constitution. So Dr. Engstrand is a beloved professor from USD's Department of History, a Professor Emerita. She herself attended USC for her bachelor's, master's, and her PhD degrees, but I know she still loves us the best. And that paved the way for her becoming a history expert specializing in Spanish exploration during the 18th century. She's published numerous articles and over 25 books. She served as the editor of the Journal of San Diego History from 2004 to 2018, and she presently serves as a director of the San Diego Maritime Museum. Most notably, in 2007, the King of Spain awarded her the Medal of the Order of Isabel la Católica for outstanding contributions to the history of Spain in the Americas. Okay, but we have another illustrious faculty member. He is facilitating today's conversation. His name is Dr. Dickson. He's been a faculty member at USD since 1987. He hired me for my job. So and I'm happy he did. He is a former political science department chair, and he has served for 29 years as the undergraduate pre-law advisor. He has also been a long-term member of our rank and tenure committee, mentoring faculty throughout the years to be excellent USD faculty. His own personal research focuses on the US Supreme Court, justice in common law countries, lay justice, and the relationship between law and democracy, which is more and more important to think about these days. Thank you both for being here and providing your academic perspectives on today's important topics. I've kind of skimmed through all. Can you hear all those dings? I'm sorry. I thank you for being here and providing your academic perspectives. I can see in the audience a lot of your former students and alumni of USD. I think that is magnificent. I want to thank everybody in the audience, regardless of if you're an alumni or not, for being here. We will be taking your questions in the chat room throughout the presentation, and we will save the last 20 minutes or so for that Q&A session with our speakers. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Dickson, and there we go. Enjoy.
Thank you, Dean Norton. Dean Norton, by the way, the best dean ever. She has done a great job with us through a very difficult year, and I'm amazed that she had the time to make it here, but I know that she loves Iris, and that's why. So this is going to be kind of a chain introduction. The introductions might last longer than the speech. I don't know. I wanted to mention one thing about Constitution Day. Constitution Day is the most ironic holiday of the year. It is the day that we are legally required to celebrate the document that gives us our liberties. And if we don't do it, we lose federal funding. So that's how we celebrate our freedom, with a coerced holiday. That said, I think it's important. It's a good thing to do. So off we go, whether we want to or not. Iris. Iris is a California girl. She is a USD institution. She grew up in Newport Beach. She went to USC, as Noel said, go Trojans. She worked for the Dodgers. She knew the O'Malley family, the coaches, the players. You talk to her, you find out all of the things that she's done in California. The only gap in her California resume is somehow she was never a roadie for the Beach Boys. And I don't know what happened there, but everybody has to have a regret. After earning her PhD, she became just the second female professor at the College for Men. She taught an incredible number of regular classes at USD, but she also taught classes in Spain, and she dragged USD presidents, provosts, deans, faculty, students, friends of the university. I suspect at least some of you, everywhere from Santiago de Compostela to Granada and everywhere in between. She's one of those rare people where it's almost literally true that everybody who meets her loves her. And I know that that's why you're here today too. I do know as a fact, USD would not be USD without her. She might be retired, but she remains incredibly active in public issues that concern San Diego. She's deeply involved in projects to improve Balboa Park, Cabrillo National Monument, and other activities going around the city. Iris knows everyone worth knowing in San Diego, and she knows countless of us who aren't worth knowing as well. All the movers and shakers of San Diego routinely call her up and ask her for advice, and I do too. I'm proud to call her a mentor and a friend for 33 years and counting, and I'm so proud to introduce Iris Engstrand. Iris, take it away.
Well, thank you, Dale, for all those nice things. And I'm very glad to see a number of my former students in the audience here. And I wish you would all just send me a note. I love hearing from my former students and knowing what they're doing, that I had a little influence in their lives. And of course, now it's Constitution Day, and that's why we're going to be celebrating more or less the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which was on August 18th, and this gave voting rights to women, but you have to remember that it didn't give all women the voting rights, and in fact, there was still a lot of struggling about the amendment. One of the interesting parts is this 19th Amendment was just not really accepted by everybody in the Senate and the House. In fact, it was so not easily ratified that even though the Senate had passed it, good vote, 25-4, it was tied in the House. And we sort of know what that means since we've had a few problems between the House and the Senate these days. Well, it was 48-48, and there was one southern state that looked like they had a chance to maybe change their mind and vote for it. And one of the Tennessee legislators, Harry Burns, got a note from his mother, and the note said, "Harry, be a good boy. Vote in favor of the women's right to vote, the 19th Amendment." So he said, oh my gosh, I have to do what my mom says. And so he did, and it broke the tie. So it was 49-47 in the House, and the 19th Amendment passed. And I think it's really interesting that one of those moms still had influence in those days over their sons in the legislature. And the other thing to remember is that this was not an amendment that gave all women the right to vote. Decades would pass before women of color or American Indian women could celebrate the right to vote. In fact, it took clear till the voting rights of 1965 to give these women the right to vote. And so now today, as we celebrate Constitution Day, we hope that everyone who does have the right to vote will have that opportunity. Nevertheless, with today's pandemic, we're going to hope that everyone who can vote will be able to do so by mail or somewhere with a local public library or polling place. And so we just want to know really what the Constitution means to us today. And we have to remember, and that's why I love teaching history, and I love seeing all my history majors here in the audience, that many other rights that are taken for granted now were not given to women. In fact, they included rights to own land, rights to inherit, rights in the workplace, and many others. And so one suffragette, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, included in one of the conventions that women's suffrage be included as a right in the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments in 1848. Well, when she said something about the women's right to vote, the men had to take notice.
Iris, sorry, as kind of the host here and moderator, I'm going to interrupt every now and then just to ask you a question. And I want to know, after you said that, who else stood out at these early conventions?
Well, as the people who study history know, abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison and some of the others who were really known for the abolitionists were the ones that stood out. But we have one Black woman, Sojourner Truth, who gave a speech at an annual anti-slavery convention. As a Black woman, she had taken this unusual name, and I know some of you have heard it. Sojourner Truth means a Christian traveling to spread the truth. She was so nervous at the convention, however, that she instead sang a song, "I Am Pleading for My People," which was her own original composition, sung to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. Well, Truth's real name was Belle Baumfree. She was one of 10 or 12 children born to Dutch-speaking Black slaves, James and Elizabeth Baumfree. Their owner, a Dutch Colonel Hardenbar, had bought James and Elizabeth Baumfree from slave traders and kept their family at his estate in a big hilly area called by the Dutch name of Swartkill, some 95 miles north of New York City. Well, when the son inherited the father's estate, he continued to enslave people as part of that estate's property. So,
that's interesting. What about the abolition movement? Did women want to join with the men who were running it at the time or not?
Oh, yes. No, these women did. No, the abolition movement was really supported by most of the women who felt that and I know some of you know the story of Harriet Tubman and some of the others. And so the right to vote movement continued through the abolition movement in the 1850s. Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison still had, were preaching to the people. They had a second women's rights convention in 1851, which was attended by those of you who know Horace Mann, Henry Ward Beecher, whose daughter Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the Uncle Tom's Cabin. So at the abolition convention in 1853, Sojourner Truth's talk came to be featured there, but unfortunately there was a lot of men who were hissing and groaning. And so Truth said, "You may hiss as much as you please, but women will get their rights anyway. You can't stop us neither." Sojourner, like other public speakers, tried to get the audience to respond by her speaking out for women's rights. And she said to, remember that even the women who were quoted in the scripture had a tough time. So they're just fighting for their rights. So when Sojourner scolded the crowd for all their hissing and rude behavior, reminding them that God says to honor thy father and thy mother.
Were there other conventions, or did they just call it quits at that point?
Oh, no. There are people like Susan B. Anthony that you've all heard of, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They organized what was called the American Equal Rights Convention of 1866. And they addressed the convention in 1867. And this time, Sojourner Truth was received with loud cheers instead of hisses, now that she had established a better reputation. The Call, a newspaper, had advertised her name as one of the main convention speakers. And she spoke mainly about the rights of Black women. She argued that because the push for equal rights had led to Black men winning new rights, now is the best time to give Black women the rights they deserve too. Throughout her speech, she kept stressing, we should keep things going while things are stirring. We could probably say that now. But she feared that once the fight for Black rights settled down, it would be a long time to warm people back up to the idea of women, especially Black women, having equal rights. And she always included references from the Bible. She was rather religious. And she ended her argument by accusing men of being self-centered, saying, man is so selfish that he has got women's rights and his own too, yet he won't give women their rights. He keeps them all to himself. And so for the final session of her speech, she just continued to talk about women's right to vote. And she said, women own her, she said, I own my own house as do other women and must therefore pay taxes. Nevertheless, women were still unable to vote because they were women. Black women who were enslaved were made to do hard manual work, such as building roads. Sojourner argued, if these women are able to perform such tasks, they should be allowed to vote, because surely voting is easier than building roads.
Now, oh, sorry, again, real quickly. I know if you read the 15th Amendment now without knowing the history, you would kind of assume that women were included because it gives citizens the right to vote. Weren't women widely considered citizens, and what did women think about this?
Well, somehow they kept getting left out and out of the word citizen. And it was because the majority of men just couldn't, agree to the fact that women were just as much a citizen as the men. And so that meant women had to keep up their fight. And the other thing that's interesting is that there were a number of female anti-suffragists who believed a women's place was in the home only. Josephine Dodge founded the National Association opposed to women's suffrage because many women did not want the vote. They did not have the time or the interest to learn about issues. Some women believe their real power lay in their difference from men, their ability to bear children and their moral superiority. Of course, we know that. Even today, there are women who still believe a woman's place is in the home. Kamala Harris was characterized as being too ambitious by some women. Well, have any men running for office been called too ambitious?
Sorry, Iris, did any women at the time kind of stand up and run for president or do anything audacious like that?
Yeah, well, during the decade of the 1870s, significant strides were made in the women's movement. In fact, Victoria Woodhall, a leader in the suffrage movement, who was born in Ohio, ran for president in 1872 at the age of 34. She was just under the mandated age of 35. Victoria Woodhull was a radical in many ways during her lifetime, but she made history in 1872 as the first woman to run for the presidency. She was one of 10 children born in Ohio to a poor family, but she and her sister Tenny were so smart that they caught the attention of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who helped him start the first women-run stock brokerage company in the nation. She addressed the House Judiciary Committee on behalf of women's suffrage in 1871. She argued that women already had the right to vote since gender wasn't specified in the 14th and 15th Amendment. And I'm sure this is a very tricky definition of citizen, that men were still powerful enough to keep women out of that word. Then Susan B. Anthony admired Victoria Woodhull, so she encouraged 15 women to vote for U.S. Grant in the election of 1872. They were actually arrested for voting. But recently, President Trump officially pardoned Susan B. Anthony, who died in 2006. He noted that she was arrested in 1872 for voting before it was legal for women to do so. She was never pardoned, he exclaimed in a White House ceremony. Did you know that she was never pardoned? What took so long? Well, it was partly that Anthony did not want to be pardoned, according to historians who pointed out that she didn't think she'd done anything wrong, so you couldn't pardon her. Joining these voices was the executive director of the National Susan B. Anthony Museum in Rochester, New York. Objection, Mr. President. Susan B. Anthony must decline your offer of pardon, wrote Deborah L. Hughes in a statement. Anthony wrote in her diary in 1873 that her trial for voting was the greatest outrage history ever witnessed. She was not allowed to speak as a witness in her own defense because she was a woman. At the conclusion of arguments, Judge Hunt dismissed the jury and pronounced her guilty. She was outraged to be denied a trial by jury. She proclaimed, "I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty." To pay would have been to validate the proceedings. Trump's pardon of Susan B. Anthony would have done the same. She would have had nothing to do with it. Nevertheless, for the movement for women's rights still continued almost through the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1874. Although, as most people know, it was controversial, banning alcohol nevertheless gained popularity and started to overshadow the voting situation. So it was kind of quiet for a while until 1887.
Now, I know Ida Wells gets involved here. She was a Black activist, and she was mostly known for her anti-lynching crusade, I think. At least that's how I remember her. But wasn't she involved in the suffrage movement as well?
Yes, Ida B. Wells is the daughter of a slave family who believed in education. She attended Shaw University, now Russ College, but a Black woman still couldn't cast her vote like her father could. Wells did not have the right to vote in 1892 when she spoke out against the murder of Black friends. She didn't have the right to vote in 1893 when she traveled to England, to the United Kingdom, to speak about the atrocities of lynching, which was another of her topics. And she did not have the right to vote in 1896 when she co-founded the National Association of Colored Women. And she still didn't have the right to vote in 1909 when she co-founded the NAACP. So here she was, just really an activist, but unable to vote. But in 1913, the women of Illinois gained partial suffrage, which gave them the ability to vote in presidential and municipal elections. Ida Wells decided to take advantage of this new right. With the assistance of two white colleagues, Belle Squires and Virginia Brooks, she founded the Alpha Suffrage Club, the first all-Black suffrage club in the state, in order to exercise the power of the vote. She was also selected to represent the club at the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. with the integrated Illinois delegation.
This is really fascinating. Do you have any more information about her? Sorry.
Well, recently her great-granddaughter, Michelle Duster, has written quite a bit about the suffrage movement and her great-grandmother. And so the white women were organizing a suffrage parade, but they asked the Black women to march in the back. Well, Ida Wells refused that request. After all, she was 50 years old, had been fighting for racial and gender equality for more than 30 years, and had founded a suffrage club herself. She was not about to comply with a request from the white women who are half her age, or any white women, for her to walk in the back. So as the parade proceeded, there was a lot of chaos, and so she got lost in the crowd and then inserted herself in front and center of the Illinois delegation. She deserved to have that place in history, and she knew it. Ida Wells married the editor of one of Chicago's early Black newspapers and continued her work until her death in 1931.
Any movement on the male front? Were men finally beginning to realize that maybe women should have the right to vote?
Well, yeah, some of them did, but men were continually writing about the problems of women voting. Women's brains were weak because of their small size. They had no time to study issues, so they just followed their husband's lead. And they had children to look after. Close to home, one San Diego resident, Leroy Cummings, believed in 1911 that women had no need to vote. Quote, "With female suffrage in vogue, the vote of the most profound scholar could be annulled by the ballot of a giggling damsel whose head might be composed mostly of hair." And so that was one man's opinion. Another, Harvard professor William T. Sedgwick, president of the American Public Health Association, believed in 1914 that no good could come of letting women vote. Quote, "It would mean a degeneration and a degradation of human fiber that would turn back the hands of time 1,000 years. Hence, it will probably never come. For mankind will not lightly abandon, at the call of a few fanatics, the hard-earned achievements of the ages." People believed him when he said that women should not vote because they were, quite literally, not made for it. Mental exertion could jeopardize reproductive health. So pregnant women could not afford to think about those complicated issues. And since the science of the day asserted that women could become infertile if they did too much thinking, no man would want to send his daughter or sister or wife to college or to the office, and certainly not to the ballot box. Men in both the United States and Britain believe that every element of the female anatomy, starting with the very top, their brains, disqualified their ability to vote. Women were just altogether too small.
Yeah, but at least some men at least started to see unfairness here, right? I hope. Well, we know they do at some point.
Well, yeah, you would like to think that. But in 1917, a group of women were rounded outside the White House for demanding the right to vote. They were arrested and dragged away in what became known as the Night of Terror. According to a recent article in the San Diego Union, suffragettes known as the Silent Sentinels were taken to a workhouse in Virginia where they were brutally assaulted and imprisoned. Alice Kosu had a heart attack, Dora Lewis was knocked unconscious, and Dorothy Day was slammed into an iron bench. Lucy Burns was made to stand all night, her hands shackled to the ceiling.
Yeah, again, sorry, that sounds brutal and it sounds a little too familiar to me. And I think they must have thought at some point that they couldn't win, that this was just too much.
I know, it's hard to believe some of these things that actually went on, but then some of the things that have been happening in recent times kind of makes you wonder. But despite all the reasons given as to why women should not be given the right to vote, it finally came to pass, and we're celebrating the 19th Amendment. But actually, many other countries had given women the right to vote before the United States. These were led by New Zealand, Finland, Australia, Norway, Denmark, Russia, and in 1918, after World War I, Lithuania, Canada, Austria, Latvia, Georgia, Germany, Poland, and Hungary. These are all prior to the United States. But in today's world, with the frightening coronavirus causing a pandemic, it is extremely important to have competent leadership among the countries of the world that are heavily involved. I think it's significant that among leaders doing very good jobs of running their countries at this time are women. They include heads of Germany, Denmark, Norway, Finland, New Zealand, Taiwan, and Iceland. Now, we women are making a difference throughout the world, but we can't forget that white women have had the right to vote for 100 years, since August 18th, 1919. It is important to acknowledge the determination and the sacrifice of those who worked to pass this. And they did have a lot of help from the men. I don't want to leave them out completely, because look at the man who voted because his mother told him to be a good boy. And but women, you know, running for office in 2020 need more than intelligence, charm, and wit to win. There are still people who really object to a woman holding power, much less one who is a heartbeat away from the presidency. Well, we'll see how much support women have gained coming the voting time in November. So I appreciate being able to visit with you about working for the rights of women to vote. So does anybody have a question? Dell?
I do, actually. But first, I want to thank you. That was so great. And I learned a ton, and it was fun, and it was interesting, a little depressing, but interesting. So thank you. My question is, when are you going to run for office?
Well, you know, I just love being retired so I can be traveling throughout the country. And I'm just hoping that I can work for any cause that gets this pandemic under control.
Whatever you decide to run for, I would encourage you to think about it. I'll vote for you.
Okay, I appreciate that. Do we have any questions from people in the audience?
Yes, this is Rosemary Johnston. Well, could you talk a little bit more about the role of Woodrow Wilson? Because he was very reluctant. It seems like these women who advocated for voting rights, it was like the persistent widow in the gospel, that he finally just tired of their persistence and agreed to promote it.
It's hard to understand. Of course, Woodrow Wilson in my book has a few other problems
Yeah.
with foreign relations in Mexico, but it was just, I think men were just brought up from childhood to believe that they were the ones that were supposed to lead. And I am sure that a lot of wives and mothers kind of went along with it. You sort of watch movies from the Old West and you see the westward movement, you know, the men are charging ahead and women are staying back to raise the children and hoe the fields and do all that kind of work, where men were, you know, had to go down to the town meeting, you know, and make all the decisions. And even today, I mean, just look at the number of representatives in the House of Representatives or the number of senators. I mean, we're making gains, but it's not enough. And having Kamala Harris as the vice presidential candidate is a great step forward for women, no matter what your ideas about the way the government should be run. But it's good to see a woman taking part in being able to be heard in various and on television and things like that. But in the other countries, women, as I mentioned, those countries have made great gains and have been getting. New Zealand, for example, was the first one to get the coronavirus completely under control.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Things like that.
Sorry, Amy has a question. She is raising her hand.
Hi, Dr. Engstrand. It's great to see you. I was a student of Dr. Engstrand's, graduated from USD History Department in 1988.
Wow.
Dr. Engstrand, you were my first female history professor, and you are a role model who inspired me to become a history professor, and I'm now chair of the history department at UMBC. Across the country.
Wow.
So I want to say that you have your own contributions, I think, that you've made to the positions of women in academia. But I want to ask you a question. Your talk was fascinating. You covered all of the major issues we're covering in the historiography and the memory, right, of the centennial. But could you talk a little bit more about the role of women in the West in particular, really, and kind of pushing the whole country? You know, we give a lot of praise to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but it was really the West that was more progressive in terms of giving women the vote, right, before women got the vote nationally.
Right. I think the women were pioneer women, and any woman that would strike out into an unknown territory and cross the Oregon Trail, I mean, they were already pretty strong and had a lot going for them. And so when they got even to California or some of the areas where they were able, and we had several Black women in San Francisco, Mammy Pleasant, and who were able to really make great gains. And they had to be practically self-educated, because women often, you know, had to quit school at, you know, 8 or 9 years of age to help with the chores. But I think it was that pioneer spirit. And of course, California settled late in the terms of the country. So Californians were not, you know, at the time the Constitution is adopted, they were not even part of the founding father group or there. So they thought, you know, women certainly have equal rights to men, and even more so. And they had to take care of all of the things, the planting of the crops, the taking care of the children, the doing the laundry, to everything, to burying the dead while the men were out rustling cattle or whatever they did. But they were doing their work too. But women were really the cornerstone of the movement to the West.
Iris, do you have a personal hero in the suffrage movement? Is there somebody there that you would kind of put above the rest?
No, I think they're all pretty equal. They're such hard workers. Sojourner Truth, she just makes me laugh sometimes, some of the things that she said, and I would never be able to sing a song because I was too nervous. Then they'd really know I was nervous. Or even Ida B. Wells. I mean, the fact that these women are they're very smart, you know, can have a stock brokerage thing like that, or impress men. It was hard to impress men in those days because you didn't have much of a chance. But I think another thing that people forget is most of the teachers, I would say in those days, 90% of teachers or 99% were women. So women had a lot of influence over the boys that were coming into their class and growing up. So we don't really know, like, even in my own life, how many people I was able to influence. I remember I had a student that came up to me and I said, well, gee, what are you thinking of doing after college? She says, well, I think I'll be a nurse. And I said, well, why don't you be a doctor? She said, oh, well, I don't know. I guess so. So about 10 years later, she came back and she says, guess what, Dr. Engstrand, I'm a doctor. And so it's things like that. And I remember another person who was in the construction business, and she said, yeah, it's kind of interesting because I'm in construction with all those men. I said, well, how are you doing in the union? She said, oh, yeah, well, I do work for the union. A little bit later, she came back and guess what? She said, I'm the head of the union. And so my women that I've had so many. I see Bridget O'Connor, Bridget Burr, who's in my class, who ended up doing great things, and others, and Melinda Blade, who became a leader in Our Lady of Peace Academy, and others. I wish I could see all of you, but I say, I want you to write me notes, because and Rosemary Johnson, I know she's done a lot at USD. And it's amazing, even in my own history department. I loved being chair of the history department. And I'll say one thing, and I think women chairs do a good job because they're used to settling arguments in their family. So you just look at your department sort of like a family, and you say, all right, everybody, you just got to get along, and let's stop being selfish. And it works, if everybody would just be sort of, I always think, kind of generous at heart and give every person credit for their abilities. And there shouldn't be a division between men and women as far as running the country or politics. So we'll see what's going to happen in this election.
I have a question from Catherine Statler, who we all know from the history department. She is pondering the comparison with Britain and France. Both Britain and France were a little bit slower in moving toward full suffrage for women than the United States. Britain granted partial suffrage in 1918, full about 1928. France, not until 1944. I would personally add in Switzerland, who really didn't do it until the 1970s. And just kind of her question is, what's up with the three biggest representative countries of the world being so slow in getting around to this?
Well, I just can't speak for those countries. And I lived in Spain as my other country. And of course, Catherine lived in France for quite a while. And there is a little bit of a domination, or we call it machismo in Spanish, of the men. And I wish that the women, even our neighbor Mexico, I wish the women would get more of a chance. I know quite a few women in Mexico now are leading museums and libraries and things like that, but so far not getting to run for the presidency. In Spain, I don't see a woman getting up to the top places, or even in France. It's just hard to combat centuries of male domination. But little by little, that's about all we can say, is that we're doing our best. And I know Catherine's taken over teaching some of the American history courses, and I know you're doing a good job to get those women to run for office.
Bridget O'Connor says hi, and she wanted to ask about other European nations being kind of slow as well. Elizabeth Himchak wrote and asked if you know of any notable San Diego women who led the suffrage movement here in this region.
Well, actually, I really don't. And I don't think there were very many. And it's hard. I'm just not that much of an expert on that particular time period. Mine's more in the Spanish and Mexican period and early American period. But women were, no women even nearly becoming a governor or mayors of city. That's been a pretty more pretty recent now. Our city council in San Diego is mostly women, and they're doing a much better job. Maybe the voters here in San Diego are kind of seeing the light, but it's pretty, it's a time consuming, profession to go into politics if you're a woman. And so you have to juggle your family and your husband and your job or whatever to get into politics, but we're getting a little more representation.
We all know that there are some double standards at play with women running for office. Is there one that you think is especially pernicious, especially difficult for women to overcome?
Well, I think the one thing you have to overcome is you're in charge of the family, usually. Now, I know quite a few couples where the man is just doing an equal job and stepping up to the plate. But in the sort of the old-fashioned sense, the women are the ones that are in charge of, just simple things like doing the laundry, and it takes up a lot of time going shopping. And so to run for an office, unless you're single or you have an ability to hire somebody to help you, it's just, life is tough. And the way it is now with what's going on with the pandemic and quarantining the children, I still think that the best thing to come out of it, where men are not asking any longer what women do all day. They've now found out what women do all day when they have their children at home.
Rosemary Johnston has a question. Okay, we have the 19th Amendment, it's passed, but what about the ERA? It hasn't gone over the transom, so to speak. And are there any lessons that we can bring from the suffrage movement to try to get the ERA approved? And she says, by the way, her Uncle Joe taught American history at Point Loma High School, has a plaque saying, a teacher never knows where his, sick, influence stops. And she said that he too enjoyed hearing from former students.
Yeah, I think the ERA has gotten sort of stymied, and the Equal Rights Amendment was going great in the 1960s, and Gloria Steinem and some of the women, but then actually, believe it or not, there were some women that said they didn't want the Equal Rights Amendment, and some of the states that have ratified it have they've taken their ratification away because some women were fearful of losing rights that they already had, and it's mostly to do with child care and community property and things like that. But it right now is kind of on hold, and I'm not sure it's ever going to really get passed unless the women again get together and try to get this issue back on the front of the burner. But it's pretty tough in today's atmosphere with all the other things that are going on. I think the Equal Rights Amendment is taking a little back seat. So maybe we're going to have to educate a new generation of women or girls right now to get that moving.
Let me ask a quick follow-up here, I think, and that is, do you see the problem with the ERA as being lack of just getting started, or do you seek active opposition thwarting it? I mean, which is the real problem here? Lack of momentum or opposition?
It was moving along. I mean, it was getting close to being ratified, and then the opposition showed up, and that's what's happened. And now then with the other problems that we have with equal rights, and it sort of got lost in the shuffle, but I think it's still, there's a lot of history behind the Equal Rights Amendment. It started, they started talking about it way 1820s, and 1821 they had a convention, but then it got into the suffrage movement, and then into the other problems of the country. So I don't know. I just don't think I can start being active in the Equal Rights Amendment, but I think some of the younger women, you should look into it. And those people who are teaching history today should figure out, what the right answer is. It's just hard for our country, obviously, to get an agreement on anything. And so we'll just go for it and see if women can support the Equal Rights Amendment, along with men need to support it too. And that's always tough to get everybody to join together.
Well, I think that's about it. I think we can wrap it up at this point. I want to thank USD Conversations for arranging this, setting this up. We have saved USD's federal funding for another year, so congratulations. Iris, Bridget O'Connor said, thank you so much for sharing your time and knowledge with us. I don't think I could say that any better. It was brilliant. I loved it. And thank you. You know, the limitation of Zoom is you can't hear the applause. The microphone only picks up 2 people. So you will hear me. I hope everybody joins me in at least putting up the yellow hands to say thank you.
Well, thank you. I very much enjoyed doing this, and I'm certainly keeping up with activities at USD, and I'd be happy to answer anybody's email. Just write me. It's very easy, iris@sandiego.edu. So keep in touch. I'd love to hear from you.
That is true. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you.